Hi, it's Nick S., the CD Man. This is the start of a new series. It will be replacing the What I've Been Listening To video, as I've mostly been listening to the number one albums. I started collecting the number one albums of the American Top 40 era and beyond, 1970 to the present, on compact disc. That includes the bootleg, the albums that were number one that didn't have a physical release on CD. We'll get to those, and I'll explain how I got those. Either in a mixtape version from eBay or in a bootleg that I made myself, or on vinyl if they were only vinyl-only releases. Anyway, we're starting with 1970 now. I must preference 1970 with two albums began their journeys at number one in 1969 and continued in 1970. I included those two as part of 1970. We start off with the album that was number one on November 1st, 1969. My favorite album by this group, The Beatles and Abbey Road. This is the 2019 version of the album, the Giles Martin remix, and it comes in many forms, but this is the form I chose to get. Great sounding, best sounding of the versions of the album. And there's one single from the album, Come Together and Something. John sang on Come Together, George sang on Something. On December 27th, the number one album was by the legendary rockers Led Zeppelin from England, John Paul Jones, John Bonham, Jimmy Page on guitar, and Robert Plant on vocals. It was their first number one album, second number one album overall, Led Zeppelin 2. And this is the most recent single disc pressing. All my number one albums must know are single disc pressings. And the single from the album was double-sided, charted separately. Whole Lotta Love went number 4, their highest charting U.S. single. And Living Loving Mates, Just a Woman Missed the Top 40, but made the Hot 100 in 1970. Classic stuff from Led Zeppelin, indeed. Okay, let's move it up here. Let's move on. Let's keep going here. Okay, got it. Okay. On March 7th, the first official number one album of 1970 went to number one. That was the Grammy winner for Album of the Year, Record of the Year for Record of the Year, Song of the Year for Song of the Year, Billboard's number one Hot 100 single, and Billboard's number one album, all for 1970. Say that in a mouthful. It was by a legendary duo that was winding down their time. This would be their last album together, though they would reunite for singles like My Little Town and an album called Live in Central Park, among other things. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, I'm talking about Simon and Garfunkel, and Bridge Over Troubled Water. Now, there was a previous single from the album released in the summer of 1969 called The Boxer, backed with Baby Driver, charted separately. Great stuff. You may remember The Boxer when Paul performed on Saturday Night Live after 9/11. And official singles from the album were Bridge Over Troubled Water, number one for 6 weeks in the Hot 100. Cecilia went number 4, and El Condor Pasa, If I Could, made to the top 20. Great stuff indeed. This is the 2001 pressing, released when they released their box set. I believe it's called, I'm not going to try to remember the name of the box set now. It's come out in a variety of forms, including one with a DVD featuring a 1969 television special, and a two box sets, one with the bonus tracks, one without. I chose to buy the version with the bonus tracks. Okay. On May 16th, we had a new number one album, and it was the only official studio album in the 70s for Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. They released a live album of greatest hits and albums past the 70s, but in the 70s, this was the only studio album together. Deja Vu. Now, I only know of one pressing of this album, and it came out in, we get a date on this, hold on. Came out, I believe, in 94. Now, though Ohio was released as a single, it was not on this album, as it was a rush release after the Kent State murders. Massacre, murders, whatever you call it again. Official singles from the album were Teach Your Children, Woodstock, the Joni Mitchell classic, and Our House. Great stuff indeed. On May 23rd, the first solo Beatle had his first number one to go to number one on the albums chart was Crowned, and it was the inaugural McCartney album. There were 3 so far for Paul McCartney. You can see here. This is the, let me get the year on here. 2011 pressing. Good stuff, great sound. And though there were no singles on this album, a focus track, or a track that's become a classic, is Maybe I'm Amazed, which was released later on a live album as a single and went to number 10 in 1977. Okay, now we're to June 13th and the farewell album for the Beatles. Now, Abbey Road was recorded as their last album, but this was their last album to be physically released. And it was a soundtrack to a documentary they recorded. Recently done as a TV series, Get Back. And we're talking about Let It Be. And of course, I have a 2021 single disc remaster. And for singles on this album, they go back to the single-only release Get Back from 1969. Number one for 5 weeks in the summer of 1969. And 2 singles from the album that were singles when the album was number one. Let It Be, the title cut, which was the highest debuting song on the Billboard Hot 100 to date at the time, debuting at number 6. The B-side was You Know My Name, Look Up My Number, which was not on this album. And a double-sided single, The Long and Winding Road, largely known as the Beatles' last number 1 single, and For You Blue. And when the Beatles released number 1s, For You Blue was conspicuously missing, something I've never been too happy about. Beatles and Let It Be. Okay. Let me get back here, give me a second. On July 18th, a little over a year after the Woodstock Festival, the soundtrack to Woodstock, the documentary, the great 3-hour-long documentary, went to number 1. Now, the version I have is a Target exclusive, and it has a bonus disc, a 3rd disc of tracks on here. Included on the album are artists like John B. Sebastian, Canned Heat, Richie Havens, Country Joe and the Fish, Arlo Guthrie, Sha Na Na, Joan Baez, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Nash and Young, The Who, Joe Cocker, Santana 10 years after Jefferson Airplane, Sly and Family Stone, the Butterfield Blues Band, and Jimi Hendrix. And the focus track that I chose for my compilation of number 1 album tracks was Jimi Hendrix, Star Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Instrumental Solo. And that Star Spangled Banner is probably the most popular song on this album. Moving on August 22nd, the next number 1 album, August 8th, the next number 1 album was Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Blood, Sweat, and Tears 3. Now, for some of these number 1 albums, I don't feel a proper remaster, a proper pressing has come out yet. And I will specify when that happens. And one of them is the Blood, Sweat, and Tears album. The newest pressing is a direct-to-CD, basically like burning a bootleg copy from Amazon. Insufficient, so I went and bought an earlier copy from, I'm not going to get the year on here, I guess this is one of the earlier pressings. Blood, Sweat, and Tears 3. The album had two singles, Heidi Ho and Lucretia McEvil. Next up, on August 22nd, was the second of 2 number 1 albums for Creedence Clearwater Revival, called Cosmos Factory. The album was the pressing is a 2008 pressing on the Fantasy label, and singles from the album included Traveling Band, Looking Out My Back Door, Run Through the Jungle, Up Around the Bend, Who'll Stop the Rain, I Heard Through the Grapevine, released in '76, and Long As I Can See the Light. Great stuff indeed. Probably my favorite Creedence album. On October 24th, the number 1 album was Santana. Most of you know Santana from their hits Maria Maria and Smooth. But in the 70s, they were a very big Latin-influenced rock band. And they had one line. I've known none of these guest vocalists or anything like that. The album went to number 1 is Abraxas, right here. And the pressing is from 1998. 2 singles were released from the album, Oye Como Va and Black Magic Woman, which on the album is paired with Gypsy Queen. Great stuff indeed. October 31st was the last number 1 album of 1970. And it was the second of 2 number 1 albums within a year for Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin 3. The single from the album was Immigrant Song, backed with a non-album track, Hey Hey What Can I Do, which Queen of the Blowfish later covered for a tribute album to Led Zeppelin. And one of my favorite tracks in the album that I was jamming out to today is Since I've Been Loving You, classic blues rock. This again is the last pressing of a single disc for the album. Great stuff. There you go, a wrap-up of all the number 1 albums of the 1970, excuse me. Tune in next week sometime for the number 1 albums of 1971. This is Nick S., the CD Man. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the dingy to get notifications. I'm Nick S. Keep rocking and keep listening to your physical media.